So you guys might recall we did a video about Anchor Bay's most hated DVD, the 30th anniversary Night of the Living Dead release. It was a controversial release to say the least, but something very interesting happened in that video. You guys started recommending me this title that had to do with Bill Hinzman, the original zombie from Night of the Living Dead. So naturally, I had to look into this, and here's that story. It's always interesting when I'm able to find a new horror movie to check out, especially when it has anything to do with Living Dead. If you're new to the channel, I've gone through what I call the bargain bin Living Dead films over the last year or so. I've covered movies like Return of the Living Dead, Necropolis, and Rave to the Grave. But the reality is, I go about these movies just trying to learn. Nobody goes into a movie trying to make a bad film. Sometimes things just happen that are way out of your control. So it looked like a lot of you guys enjoyed the video I did about the 30th anniversary Night of the Living Dead DVD, which included new footage made by John Russo. Now, the DVD has a horrible reputation, but a lot of you guys seem to have fond memories of just owning it, even though it may be a bad memory of seeing it for the first time. But something caught my attention on that video. A few of you guys took notice that I'm a really big fan of Bill Hinzman, which I consider to be the greatest zombie of all time. So some of you told me to check out a movie called Flesheater. Now, I had never really heard of Flesheater. I'll be honest, I'd never heard of it. But some of you said, Christian, this is going to be up your alley. This is a movie that Bill Hinzman directed, and he plays a zombie in it. I couldn't believe it at first. I was like, what? How could I not know about Flesheater? Well, the reality is, I am a casual Vinegar Syndrome collector, so I'll buy movies here and there, but the reality is, a lot of stuff gets past me when it comes to that label. So sure enough, I go online and I saw that Flesheater came out from Vinegar Syndrome. I immediately ordered it after seeing some of the comments on that video. Well, you guys asked me to watch this movie, so here we are, and is this a good bargain bin Living Dead film? Okay, so the first thing I did notice about Flesheater was that it was shot on 16mm film when I looked on the back of the 4K case, which actually had me kind of excited. If you guys might remember, I just did a review on Basket Case's new 4K release from Arrow Video. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend going to check that out. So the fact that this was 16mm was just the cherry on top to seeing this movie. Right away, I want to comment on the picture quality of this release. Now, it was shown in 4:3, and probably because this movie was direct to video, I think, it might have gotten a little bit of theatrical here and there, but I think it was edited like it was going to be for video. But right away, I noticed the picture quality on this was sensational. I will say this about Vinegar Syndrome. Even though I may not be the biggest customer they have, there's no denying their restorations are the absolute best I've ever seen, besides probably Arrow Video. But lo and behold, here I was about to press play on a zombie film that was supposed to be starring Bill Hinzman, much less directed by him. Now, this movie starts out as pretty low budget as it can seem. Despite the fact that the movie looks really good, you've got a group of kids on a tractor riding out into the middle of a forest. We hear them talking a little bit, and you find out that this is during Halloween time. Another added bonus, quite frankly. In low-budget movie fashion, what they do doesn't exactly make sense. They just park it in the middle of the woods, sit around drinking beer, dancing, making out with each other, and having low-budget dialogue. Mind you, I will say this. When the group of the actors are together, mostly these teenagers, they play off of each other fairly well. They're not exactly great, but they are charming nonetheless. One of my biggest issues with low-budget filmmaking sometimes is that these movies can just feel very much slow. They don't have a lot of money to go to big extravagant locations or have a ton of effect, so a lot of these movies might depend on storytelling. That is not the case with Flesheater. Within about 15 minutes, you see the guy who rode everybody in on the tractor driving out where he notices something on the ground. We brush the leaves aside and we see some writing that you realize is on a tombstone. Once he goes to open the tombstone, you get this amazing shot of Bill Hinzman in the casket. He immediately opens his eyes, comes out, and kills this guy. It is one of the coolest scenes of the movie, and I absolutely loved it. Right away, I learned too that this was a movie that was going to basically be going through the old school premises of zombie films. If you're bit, you're infected. So we start out in this movie with one zombie, and that is Bill Hinzman. But I want to take a little bit of a pit stop right here and talk about this. Is this a Night of the Living Dead sequel? Not really. Of course, the notoriety of Bill Hinzman's name on this definitely got people to want to check this movie out. But here's what I learned about this movie and why they wanted to make it. So during the late 80s, they were going to make a colorized version of Night of the Living Dead. Now, this movie was going to come out, and it was going to be a pretty big deal at the time. It was probably going to sell a lot of VHS tapes, maybe some Laserdisc, and it was probably going to be on TV and get a lot of press. That's great. But there's only one problem. All the money that would have been made from this colorized version and all the TV syndication money it would have got would have not gone to John Russo, George Romero, Bill Hinzman, nobody involved in the original film because of the public domain issue. So because of this, it kind of sparked Bill Hinzman up to say, hey, I think people would probably pay to see me as a zombie again. Now, when this movie was also getting released, a lot of people on the money side of this film wanted to change the name to make it sound like Living Dead as much as possible. So this movie had a number of different titles, but the funniest title for this movie has to be Zombie Nosh. What in God's name is a zombie Nosh? Here's a picture of the VHS tape that's released that has the title of Zombie Nosh on it. Now, some of you might have an answer for this, and the reality is, I'm sure that there may be a definition for Nosh, but I don't want to know what it is. I'm not going to look it up. Somebody may put it in the comments, and that's fine, but zombie Nosh has to be the silliest word I've ever heard. Now, a zombie mosh, a zombie mash, but a zombie Nosh. I don't know, but I freaking love it. I'm gonna have to get a t-shirt of Bill Hinzman one day and Zombie Nosh under it. But now let's get back to the movie. I could go through the plot, but really, there's not a whole lot to go through. One of the things that I can say about this movie, Flesheater, that no other bargain bin Living Dead movie has done so far is move like an absolute freight train. Once we see Bill come out of the grave in Flesheater around the 15-minute mark, this movie does not stop. There's also a lot of nudity, and there's a lot of graphic violence, and there's a lot of great practical effects. Mind you, it's very modest effects, but they're done really well. There's even some cool, what I thought was puppetry work at the time, because the movement of this decayed body lifting in the car looked so good. Come to find out, it was two guys with sticks behind it, just gently moving it up and down. The more you know. But this is the other thing that really surprised me about Flesheater. Sometimes when you watch low-budget films, they may front-load their movie, meaning all the great stuff you would want to see is in the first 15-20 minutes. But in Flesheater, it starts out humble, really cool, especially seeing Bill and ripping people open and shoving pitchforks in their chest. But this movie backloads itself, which I think actually worked in its favor because it keeps you interested enough in the beginning to feel like you're just watching a charming low-budget film, but then you continuously start getting more locations, more people involved, more kills, where you have a huge barn fire in this movie too. It was just crazy. It starts out where you think it's going to be a 1 or 2 location film. Mind you, it looks good, like I said. You just do not expect how wild this movie gets. If you guys haven't noticed by now, I really enjoyed Flesheater. Mind you, it is a low-budget zombie film. But in terms of entertainment and rewatchability, I think this is probably the best bargain bin Living Dead film of them all. Now, there's 2 things about Flesheater that really started running through my mind as I was watching it. First one is this. I feel like a lot of times when you're watching the genuine low-budget horror films of the 80s, you start to see those haircuts that really define the era. You know, let's take another zombie film that came out this year, for instance, Return of the Living Dead Part 2. You know, Joey's haircut, James Cameron's haircut, they look kind of timeless. They have normal haircuts. But in Flesheater, you see one guy that has the quintessential 80s mullet, but he's got the real clean sideburns, so the hair's clean right by the ear. He's got his hair a little bit short in the front, so it's spiked up, and then just a party in the back haircut. I feel like you don't see those kinds of haircuts in the bigger budget 80s films. Maybe I'm generalizing that a little bit too much, but I just feel like when you watch some of the more real low budget 80s films, you see more of those hardline 80s haircuts, more so than the stuff that has a little bit bigger production. Now, the other thing about Flesheater that I thought about, a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, this movie has so much charm to it. And charm would be the biggest word I would use for Flesheater. You know, there's movies today that come out that try to replicate the style and feel of the low-budget 80s stuff. There's some I enjoy, but that charm that I love so much, it's always missing in the movies that are trying to replicate this era. While watching the special features on this gave me all the answers that I thought were right and were in fact right in my head. A movie like Flesheater had a lot of people involved with Bill Hinzman that were friends of him or family members. As a matter of fact, a lot of Bill's family is in this movie. You may not realize it when you're watching it, but when you go to watch the features, you see that in one scene, when Bill shows up as a zombie to this house on Halloween night, this little girl answers the door. That's his kid. Then when he goes into the kitchen, there's a woman who was trying to get her kid to settle down while she's getting her ready for the Halloween party they're going to. That was Bill's wife. You get to see Bill's nephew in the film come in and see this zombie girl that was killed on the bed. You get to see other members of Bill's family throughout the film. So there's this real charm to it that is like this X factor that you can't really describe while watching it, but you know it when you're experiencing a movie like this. And just to reiterate again, what blew me away about this movie is the locations kept changing after the movie got to a certain point. Biggest surprise I learned about was this. In the end of the movie, spoiler alert, there's this big barn explosion, and I'm thinking to myself, how did they afford to build a barn for this? Now, it's not like this movie looks or feels cheap, but you can just tell that it is a modest production. Well, the way they did this is so low budget and genius. Put out an ad in the paper for anybody local that might have had an old barn that they wanted to have burned down just to get rid of it to clear out the land. Sure enough, somebody called them up and said, yes, we can do this. So then Bill called the fire department and the police department to basically regulate this thing and let the fire department safely burn down a barn. They burned it down, shot it on film, and it just elevates the film's climax to a whole nother level. So with all this being said, guys, I look back and I think about the bargain bin Living Dead films I've seen. Children of the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead 2006, Night of the Living Dead Reanimation from 2012, Return of the Living Dead Necropolis, Return of the Living Dead Rave to the Grave, and some others. Flesheater is hands down the most fun, charming, rewatchable film out of all of them. Naturally, Bill being in here gives it this really cool X factor and makes it feel like it's some sort of charming homage to Night of the Living Dead, of course, but the fact remains that this was a really fun movie. It's a low-budget, charming, fun zombie film that I think a lot of 80s fans would just get an absolute kick out of. So I really appreciate you guys not only watching my videos, but giving me recommendations for movies to watch. So let's talk about this release real quick. So this is the 4K UHD release from Vinegar Syndrome. It's a Bill Heintzman film, Flesheater, Revenge of the Living Dead. Now, when I initially learned about the Zombie Nosh title, I couldn't wait to take this artwork out and see if it was on the other side. But unfortunately, it was not. But what I do think is cool is they did get some animation work done, and this cover art is what you will see when the movie plays. This really cool animation of Bill coming towards the screen in this cartoonish look. Flesheater is a great title. As you can see on the other side, they wanted to call it Flesheater Revenge of the Living Dead. Quite frankly, I can see where the producers were coming from with that. I probably would have done the same. In terms of special features, this was literally a perfect release. You got interviews with the producer, you got interviews with the cinematographer, you got interviews with not only Bill's wife, her daughter, and there are really cool interviews with the makeup effects artist Jerry Gergley, who is awesome. It was a great, great special features release. So when it comes to Vinegar Syndrome titles, I'm actually going to put Flesheater probably in my top 10 of favorite titles I've bought. Yeah, I'm just really excited. I'm glad that this movie's a part of my life now, and I'm really appreciative that you guys are bringing movies into my life based off of videos that I've done. You know, I've been doing this zombie thing for a while now, and I really love zombie films. I know they're not for everybody, but when you finally watch one that really draws you in, it'll kind of make you want to just understand why and how some of these cheaper ones got made. There's stories behind every movie, and you will be surprised how interesting and how different the backstory might be than what you would expect. Thank you guys for bringing Flesheater into my life. I really appreciate it, and for anybody watching that hasn't seen it, maybe you should bring it into your life too. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.